Goeiemiddag, baie dankie vir die uitnodiging. Dit is baie lekker om hier te wees tussen my mense, soos ek glo, want ek het groot geword eintlik ook maar in die boerdery plek. Ek sê Engels praat, maar nie worry nie, ek moet net die begin net in Afrikaans doen. Dit is makliker dat hy net eers in die gang kom. Ek wil iets met julle deel wat nou die dag my gebeur het. Ek gee glad nie om voor mense te praat nie, maar die nou die dag word ek genooi deur 'n groep vrouens by 'n vroueklap en dit is een van die gehore waarvoor ek baie bang is en dit is 'n vrouens. En dit is die aand. En dis my beurt om met hulle nou te praat so net na die wynproe. En dis 'n groot saal, omtrent soos die en toe ek nou so instap, dit klink soos 'n hoenderhok, toe se mense so deel. Toe ek voor gaan staan, toe sê ek vir hulle so waar moet ek begin? En so ouerige dame spring op, sy sê begin met jou hemp. Begin met jou hemp, sê sy. So meneer waar. Dis 'n klomp mansies, so ek gaan nie met my hemp begin vandag. Alright. Okay, my job is to talk about the global economy and what the South African economy, and it keeps on changing all the time. I sat there at the back trying to figure out what's going on and having a look at the oil price this morning. It was at $118, so it's down back to $105 now. I don't know where it is at the moment because it keeps on changing. What is clear, however, is that the world's going to change. The world changed in the past, well, just over a week. And it's going to be a different world. What it's going to look like, I'm not sure. But I think a good place to start, perhaps, is to, before I get to that, is just to talk about one or two trends, one or two things that we need to be aware of. I listened to what Werner had to say about the maize price the last couple of years, and obviously if you look at the price of millies, it's been going up and all the time, sometimes a little bit up and a little bit down and so on. But we economists, we don't, of course you look at the short-term trends of things, but what I really like looking at, if you really want to get a bit of a grasp of what's going on in the world of what we call the economy, is to look at prices over a long period of time. And if you look at prices, and that's a bit of a problem, because if you look at prices, what prices are you talking about? Werner has been showing you prices in dollars or in rands, but those prices do not give you real idea of what's really going on, because the ruler that you are using, the thing that you measure it against, and that's money, keeps on changing as well. So and that's called inflation, because money keeps on losing its value. So if you actually have to take the effect of inflation out of that, to get a better idea on what prices really are doing over time. And then you have to stand back, because in the short term, we've got all these La Ninas and stuff that affect the price, that affect the weather, and that. And so you can't really see what the longer term trend is. But if you do some adjustments, look at the long term trend, fix it in real terms, for example, then something very weird is happening to just about everything, including the price of agricultural produce. And that is that prices are falling. If you adjust it for one or two other ways, you can adjust it, for example, on how much labor you need to put into buying something. How much labor? Let me give you one example, what I'm talking about. 200 years ago, they didn't have electricity. If you want to read a book, and you need 1,000 lumens to read a book, and 1,000 lumens, you need 3 candles. 3 candles to provide enough light to read a book for 1,000 lumens. If you worked and you buy 3 candles, you had to work for 6 hours 200 years ago to buy 3 candles to generate 1,000 lumens to read for an hour at night. So an hour's light cost you 6 hours of labor. Today, light costs you 0.0014 seconds of labor. The price of light absolutely collapsed. And just about all prices collapsed the last couple of pick a period. And things are becoming cheaper, not only cheaper, a lot cheaper. Another very good example, something that happened recently. There's some girls here, and I would like to ask the girls, for example, if you've got a choice between a diamond that was mined, 5-carat diamond that was mined in Botswana, or a diamond that's manufactured in China, in a lab, a nice 5-carat diamond. Which one will you pick? And I promise you, the girl's going to say they're going to pick the one that comes from Botswana. And the reason why is because they're not interested in diamonds. They are interested in expensive diamonds. That's what they want. And the reason why they want expensive diamonds is because they want to walk around with this and say, we are rich, we are rich, we are rich. And my husband loves me, my husband loves me. And you can't do that with a cheap diamond. You want an expensive diamond. But what's happening in China today, they're manufacturing diamonds cheaper. And by the way, those two things are basically the same thing. There's no difference between one of those diamonds they get in Botswana and the other one coming from a lab in China. But because of the increase in production processes and technological advances, the prices of manufacturing diamonds are coming down in China. And in fact, so much so that in many cases, the Chinese government they set a floor price. You're not allowed to sell certain things below a certain price because there's too much competition, as they say. So the floor price for diamonds today per carat is $15 in China. So that means Botswana exports 25% of the economy is diamonds. Just imagine what's going to happen to the Botswana economy. That's why they can't sell the beers, because nobody buys diamonds anymore. Because you can't say, we are rich anymore, because you just bought it for China for $300 or 600 Rand a carat, for example. And that's another example of things that are getting cheaper. Things are getting cheaper, and we are, in fact, with new technology like artificial intelligence, we have been living in a most amazing period of abundance. We are probably entering a period of superabundance, where everything will get cheaper and cheaper and cheaper. And that's why I say, if you are in any industry where you manufacture something or produce something, you must know something. Based on what's been happening to prices the last couple of many years, decades, centuries, things are getting cheaper. And the stuff that you are selling will become cheaper as well. And that means that if you want to survive in whatever business you are in, you must make sure that you do two things. You use the best technology and you use the best skills to make sure that you maintain your profitability. That's not all. In the case of agriculture, you need some extra stuff that you need to do. And that is happening in agriculture. Agriculture is a little bit of a Johnny-come-lately. Agriculture, the typical business model of agriculture, until recently, and in many instances still the case, the typical model of agriculture is Papa besit die plaas. He's the mechanic, he's a personnel manager, he borrows the money from a bank, input cost, and he harvests and give the harvest to the coöperasie, and eventually Boetie take over the farm. That's not a modern way of running a business. A modern way of running a business is to have a big business, to have it in companies, to have boards, to have a chairman, to have a constitution, shareholders agreements, and Boetie is not necessarily the best guy to run the farm. You leave that to a professional manager and you become a shareholder. Agriculture, especially in South Africa, is being corporatized, and that's the right thing to do. So for that reason, I'm very excited about agriculture as well. Coming back to prices a little bit, but there are some prices that are going up. Not all prices are coming down. Some prices are going up, and the prices that are going up are typically prices where people do stuff to other people. And the prices that are going up are the prices of teachers, of medical personnel, of people working in restaurants, people working in other people's houses. Those kind of prices. Going to a hotel, going to Rwanda to watch the gorillas is becoming much more expensive because it's a service industry. Don't buy your wife a diamond anymore. Take her to go and see the gorillas. And that's what rich people are doing today. They spend money on experiences because things are getting cheaper and cheaper. And just by the way, if you want to advise your kids on what to do, advise your kids to enter the service industry in one way or the other, because everything is becoming service orientated, and the world today is the tertiary economy. It's an economy that happens in the clouds, and agriculture is part of that, because a large chunk of value add in agriculture happens in a lab. Our drone pilots, our genetic engineers, those are the people that are all part of agriculture, and they're part of the service industry. Okay, that's just a part thing about agriculture. So let me just, there's another trend I just want to talk about a little bit, and there are many other trends. I just wanted to mention this one about prices. The other one has to do with an industry that I'm very keen on, and that's the industry called finance, and I absolutely love money. I love money. I love money for the obvious reasons, because you can use money to buy things. But I love money because the more and more I learn about money, The more and more I study money, the more I see how important money is for this thing that we call the economy. And as you see how money evolved over time, you will see every time money evolved from one thing to the other thing, the result of that was this increase in economic activity. And we're starting to use a new kind of money. And that is also likely to lead to this increase in the production of things, increasing all these things, this wonderful world in which we are living in, more goods and services that will be produced. Money evolved, started off with a barter economy. Then we started using some things for money, shells and cattle and slaves and women. That was too expensive. We stopped with that. We moved into gold money or precious metals, paper money, electronic money, and today there's a new kind of money, we call it crypto money. But there are two kinds or three kinds of crypto money I just want to mention to you, or just to explain to you why that is going to be important. One kind of crypto money is what we call Bitcoin, or private sector crypto money. And we all know about Bitcoin and what's been happening, but I want to talk about two other kinds of crypto money that's becoming more and more important. The one is central bank digital currencies. And central bank digital currencies, especially countries where the governments like to intervene, wants to have a hands-on, want to try to do all sort of things to the economy, they like to rather follow the central bank digital currency route. And the central bank digital currency is like a Bitcoin. It's a central bank Bitcoin, if you like. But the big difference between a Bitcoin or a private sector digital currency and a central bank digital currency is that the central bank digital currency is programmable. And in 2029, the Europeans want to start issuing their central bank digital euro. And a number of these central bank digital currencies already exist. Remember, the European way of managing the economy is to interfere there. They've got a socialist bunch of governments in Europe. They've red tape. They've got a lot of taxes. That's the approach of the Europeans. While the approach of the Americans is more of a laissez-faire kind of approach. Leave it to the private sector. And you see that in their policies when it comes to money as well. So the Europeans, they want to establish a central bank digital currency. And the thing about the central bank digital currency is that it is a programmable currency, which means whoever issues this currency will be able to see all the transactions that you do from your wallet on your cell phone. And they can see, for example, that you've got a bit of a brandy and coke problem. And from now on, they will program your wallet so you cannot buy alcohol anymore. So that is potentially what can happen to a central bank digital currency. And it will be impossible to evade any taxes because everything will be transparent and they will see everything. And of course, whoever's in charge of the central bank digital currency can potentially use this or abuse this really to really make life difficult for all of us. And it already exists. If you say something bad about government, in China, for example, you can't buy a train ticket. So it's a way, just imagine this in the hands of a real despot, and there are many examples of that. So that's a European approach. The American approach is completely different. An American approach, they have what it's called a so-called stable coin, and a stable coin works as follows in simple terms. So you will come to me, you give me 100 Rand, I put 100 Rand in a bank, and I will get the interest on that 100 Rand. And in return, I'll give you on your wallet, on your cell phone wallet, I'll give you a stable coin. And you can bring the stable coin back to me whenever you want to, and I'll give you 100 Rand back to you. Okay. But you like the stable coin because you can use the stable coin for transactions amongst your friends and businesses and everywhere, and the transaction costs are so much lower. It's very cheap to use this. I like this, obviously, because I get the interest on your 100 Rand. The problem is that what if you come back with the stable coin and 100 Rand is not there anymore? Remember, I've got a brandy problem. I use it to buy brandy. No, 100 Rand is not there. So there's a big flaw in this whole business plan. And that's why the Americans, they've got a plan, and last year they promulgated an act, and it's called the Genius Act. And Donald Trump says it's named after him, the Genius Act in the US. So how this works, the Genius Act basically, if you want to issue coins, so-called stable coins, then you have to make sure the money is in the bank, and you have to get an auditor or some inspector to make sure the money is in the bank. And stable coins are becoming more and more popular. In fact, the biggest buyers, or one of the biggest buyers for government bonds today, are stable coin issuers. This year, they're probably going to buy something like $500 billion worth of American debt instruments. So you give them the dollars and they buy government debt instruments with that. And by buying all these government debt instruments, they affect the interest rate patterns on the capital markets, on the financial markets, for example. And what they do, they take money away from the banks and give it to stablecoin issuers, and the banks don't like that because they lose their deposits. And if they lose their deposits, they can't lend it out to somebody else and make a margin on that. So the banks don't like this, and that's why the banks want to change the legislation in the United States. But it's not only the banks that don't like it, the credit card guys also don't like it because transaction costs are so much lower, and the Visas and the MasterCards and those various credit card companies do not like this as well. But there's another use for this. Since this is simply information, you can send this information wherever you want to, all over the world. And in the case of South Africa, the following is possible. In South Africa, you are limited to 2 million rand. That's the amount of money that you can take out of South Africa. It's called an allowance. Imagine after I've paid my taxes and everything, I've got an allowance. I'm an adult man, but I've got an allowance of 2 million rand that I'm allowed to take out of the country. Okay, but that's called foreign exchange regulations. Now, in South Africa, you've got that. But what if I transfer, and it's limited to 2 million rand, 100 million rand from my bank account and put it on my Luno app. And on my Luno app, I convert my 100 million rand into 100 million rands worth of Bitcoin. And in my Luno app, I convert my 100 million rands worth of Bitcoin and I buy 100 million rands worth of US dollar stable coins. And I send it to my kids in London, and I've just externalized 100 million rands worth of money, and nobody can stop me. But we still have foreign exchange regulations. So I've just given you a plan how to take more than 2 million out of the country, and nobody can stop you unless they switch off the internet. And the question now is, what if everybody starts using the US dollar stable coins, and it is being used more and more? In fact, Europeans are very concerned about this. They say that there are too many American dollar stable coins in circulation in Europe. That means that the Europeans can't use monetary policy anymore because people don't use the euro anymore. They use the stable coin. And in the case of South Africa, we don't have a police force anymore. We know that. We don't have an army anymore. We don't have local municipalities anymore. If we don't have a currency anymore, do we still have a country? Those are the philosophical questions that one can ask. So that's another technology that I just want you to be aware of. Now, I'm going to get to the war, but first, before I get to the war, let me just walk around the world to see where the world was just before the war. And that's not too long ago. The Russian economy is currently growing at a rate of just under 1%. The Russian economy has been transformed into a war economy. They've got some serious inflationary pressures building up in Russia. They're running out of all kind of reserves. Human reserves, but also out of money. They're starting to run out of money. The momentum is certainly behind the war economy, the Russian economy there. But within a year or two, the Russian economy will start experiencing some serious problems. You need a big and a strong economy to wage a war. They have been in Ukraine for 4 years. It took them 5 years in the Second World War to win the Second World War, losing many, many millions of people. But they can't, after 4 years, they simply couldn't win. They couldn't win the war against Ukraine, which is used to be the most corrupt country in Europe and is basically a third world country. So they can't win this war. But I don't think Putin will try to get into some sort of peace agreement or ceasefire because he's got some other plans. And the plans include taking over Odessa and eventually linking up Transnistria with the rest of Russia as well. So I don't think that war will come to an end soon. But in the meantime, they're running into some serious economic problems in Russia, and they're running out of people as well. Population growth is very strongly negative in Russia. But that thing eventually, what's happening in Ukraine at the moment, eventually can start pulling in some European countries as well. One should be very concerned about that war in Ukraine. Another economy that I just want to touch on quickly are the Chinese economy. They tell us they're growing about 4.5% or between 4 and 5%. I do not believe that for a number of reasons. One is that they've got some significant problems on local authority level. The local authorities are very deep, they've got major debt problems. They also have a bit of an asset bubble in property bubbles, and that asset bubble has been deflating for some time now. And a major problem with the Chinese, they've got this massive production capacity leading to prices keep on falling down, and demand, the consumption expenditure in China is quite weak. The Chinese keep on saving. And that's a very interesting point what I just made, because think about this. So the Chinese export more than what they import, and in the return they get dollars. And they've got all these dollars in reserves, okay, because the dollar is the most important reserve currency in the world. Now, the only way that you can sell, they take these dollars, is, by the way, and they invest it back in the United States, typically in US Treasury bills, the same kind of assets in which these stablecoin issuers put their money as well. Now, if the Chinese want to get rid of the American dollar as the world's most important reserve currency, they can sell all these bonds. So if they sell the bonds, they get dollars in return. So what do you do with the dollars then? You buy gold, say, for example. You buy gold, and then the other guy's got a lot of dollars, and then he's got to do something with the dollars. See, the point I want to make, the Americans got us. Whether we like the Americans or not, the US dollar will remain the world's most important reserve currency. In the meantime, the Chinese are exporting more than what they're importing, and they don't want, and they're getting dollars in return of that for that, whether you like the dollars or not. So the only way that they can get away from the US dollar, the only way they can reduce the role of the US dollar as the world's most important reserve currency, is to get their local economy to start consuming more, so that you export less and less and less, and eventually start importing more than what you export, so you can pay back the dollars to the Americans, for example. But if you do that, you must put the pressure on your local production. And that means that will put downward pressure on economic growth in China. So it just goes to show, everybody talking about the end of the US dollar, it is just not going to happen. For a long time, at least. So the Chinese economy, they're telling us they're growing 4 or 5%. I don't believe it. It's probably much weaker. Population growth is strongly negative in China. That economy is not going to be the world's driving force, economic driving force anymore. That is probably going to move to the Indian. The Indian economy is doing very well. And the Indian economy growing at about 8% or so. Population growth is still positive. The business plan is slightly different from the Chinese. And if there are questions about that a little bit later, we can talk about that. And that's the economy where I will put my money. Interesting also, the Indian economy entered into a free trade agreement with the Europeans, and that is because of the shenanigans of Donald Trump with all these tariffs and things. So the Indians and Europeans are getting quite close to one another, and the Indians are very close to the Israelis as well. In fact, 2 weeks ago, Narendra Modi was visiting Benjamin Netanyahu in Israel. So the relationship there is quite good as well. So the Indian economy, that's a place where one wants to be. The European economies are rich economies, but the economic growth is very weak. So they're rich, but the population growth is negative, and the only little bit of economic growth that we find there is because of the Germans spending more on defense spending, and that leads to a bit of an increase in economic growth in Europe, but not much. The super economy remains the American economy. They just keep on growing and growing and growing, and it seems, just before the war, it seems that there's a bit of, in fact, an acceleration in economic growth in Europe, or rather in the United States. I did mention the US dollar will remain the world's most important reserve currency. So that's where the world was until 2 weeks ago. Or maybe I can just mention the BRICS countries as well. So there's this countries, it's called the BRICS 10 today. It used to be called BRICS with a small s, and that small s at the back is South Africa. We shouldn't be part of the BRICS countries, but the BRICS countries was said to be this huge political force and this huge economic force. Well, let me just touch on that before I get to the war in the Middle East. And the war in the Middle East happened, and nothing came from the BRICS countries. 1 or 2 countries, they said it's bad, that there should be peace, and this and that and the other. But clearly, BRICS is a grouping of countries without teeth. It doesn't mean much. It's good for South Africa to be part of the BRICS countries. It's got to give us opportunities to trade, but that's about it. It's not a military force. It's not really a political force. It is not any real kind of force. It's a very loose grouping of countries. Not that we shouldn't be part of it, but don't think BRICS is going to be this massive political force. And then the war broke out. Now, everything changed since then. The oil price, as one would have expected, the oil price went up to currently $105. I've just had a look. The correct level for the oil price is probably well below $70. There are reasons why I say that. So it's well below 7, it's up to $105. The Strait of Hormuz has been closed, which means that oil can't get out. And the biggest danger here is not the oil price as such. The biggest danger is if this goes on for a long period of time. That is the biggest issue because it becomes baked into the economies. It's the biggest. It gets baked into prices, and it starts. The process of inflation starts picking up momentum, and to slow that momentum down takes a long time through higher interest rates. And that's the biggest challenge here. That's the biggest danger from an economic point of view, is that the oil price remains elevated for a long period, which means that the cycle of downward interest rates is likely to come to an end if the longer it stays there. I think that the oil price, there's some analysts talking about the oil price of $120. This morning it was at $118. Some talking about $120. Some even talking about $150 for oil. So it's not only petrol prices are going to go up, the oil prices are going to go up, fertilizer prices are going to go up, and all sort of other prices are going to go up as well if the oil price remains where it is. But even if the oil price goes back to $70 overnight, the shock is already into the system. And what we saw in South Africa, I expected further rate cuts soon. Now that certainly will be postponed. I'll get to South Africa a little bit later. How long will this war go on? Well, I think this war could go on for quite some time. Apparently, there are many of these drones that the Iranians still have, and it's very difficult to really shoot down all these drones. They've just re-elected Ayatollah, the other Ayatollahs of the supreme leader's son, as the new supreme leader in Iran. So it's a new dynasty. They got rid of the Shah, and they've got the theocracy or a dynasty with the Ayatollahs, which is pretty much the same kind of thing. The problem in Iran is that there is no strong real opposition. The Shah's son, the Pahlavis, he's probably a weakling. He's not going to be a good leader. But apart from that, there's nobody else that can potentially take over in Iran. The only potential force that can really make life very difficult, except for the Americans and the Israelis, are the Kurds. But the Americans are talking, Donald Trump are talking about supporting the Kurds. But there are many Kurds in Iraq and many Kurds in Turkey as well. And they're not going to like that if Donald Trump starts supporting the Kurds there as well. So this war can go on for quite some time, and that means that the oil price is likely to remain elevated and maybe even increase even further. What is also interesting is how the various countries are positioning themselves in this war. Look at China, for example. They're not saying anything. There was a press release, and that's basically it. But look at the Russians, also quite quiet. Look at the BRICS countries, not saying anything or hardly anything. There are rumors that the Chinese and the Russians are providing intelligence to the Iranians. If that is true, and eventually the Russians are pulled into this war, then we're talking about something completely different. But from now, what is clear is that the Americans and the Israelis are the really big forces here. And also interesting, some of the Arab countries are talking about retaliating against the Iranians. Who would have thought that the Arab countries will fight on the side of the Israelis against another Muslim country, for example? So the world, without a doubt, is changing, and it's a very, very dangerous place. And the longer the oil price remains where it is, the longer this conflict goes on, the more of an impact it will have on the world economy. Coming to South Africa, and a few words about politics in South Africa. I don't want to go too much into history, but it's important to try to understand it's where everything begins, why the ANC is what it is, and why they have certain alliances and so on. So because of time, I'm not going to go too much into that. But suffice to say is that the ANC, the ideological roots of the ANC goes back 100 odd years or so, just during the time just after the Industrial Revolution, during the time of Karl Marx, during the time of the Russian Revolution. That is the ideological roots of the ANC. And it makes sense in a way if you go in history a little bit. But suffice to say, they're a bunch of socialists, and ideologically they think of themselves as communist or developmental state or interventionist or whatever name you want to give them. It also makes sense that the ANC should include in the tripartite alliance, in their alliance, the South African Communist Party, because the Communist Party are the ideologues. They are the intelligentsia, not to be confused with intelligence, those are different things, but they are the intelligentsia. And it also makes sense for the ANC to take the CUSATU, the biggest trade union federation, to be part of the alliance as well, because that's the origin of socialism or communism. It has to do with labor value theory. That's something that Karl Marx, that's goes to the heart of his thinking about communism. So that's what we have, an ideology that's completely outdated because the modern economy today, like I said at the beginning of my talk, is a service-driven economy. It happens in the clouds. You need to have, people don't work in blue overalls with greasy hands anymore. You work in a white overall with an iPad in your hand. You do AI stuff. You're probably an engineer. So the workforce has changed completely. And the ideology doesn't fit in a modern economy. And the policies doesn't fit in a modern economy. Policies like the centralization of just about everything. Policies like expropriation. Even policies like BEE or even NHI or Bella. All those kind of policies is the ANC trying to centralize stuff. Because that's how things worked in a world what they believe in a world where the state is the vanguard, or the party is the vanguard party looking after us, or looking after the people. And that's why they have the wrong policies. But there are two more things that the ANC basically, that is also in what the ANC not stands for, but characterized by. And that is that the ANC, they send people and employ people in certain positions. They call it cadre deployment because they want to control everything. That's part of their ideology. But another name for cadre employment is just incompetence, because you send people in positions that they can't do the job necessarily. As long as they represent the vanguard party, that's all good and well. And the fourth thing is that the ANC is quite often known for very high levels of corruption as well. And if you put these four things together, you get what you have in South Africa, and that is the most horrible economic destruction, the most horrible destruction of value that this country has ever seen, at just about all levels. The local authorities have been decimated. The state-owned enterprises have been destroyed. The fiscal numbers of the Minister of Finance has never been as bad as it is today because of the ANC mostly. Now I can give you the numbers. The local authorities, the outstanding debt of the local authorities to Eskom is well in excess of 100 billion rand. It was less than half that a year ago. They were supposed to start paying back that debt. They haven't, because they are badly managed. We're going to have local authority elections the end of this year or early next year, and the world is changing. That's a good news part of South Africa. But the local authorities, they don't have water. This Johannesburg, they don't have water. They don't have electricity. They don't have pavements. The police are corrupt. It's a nightmare what's happening in local authorities. But there are signs that things are changing and things are being turned around, but it's a long, long, long way before we were able to fix the local authorities. The state-owned enterprises, Eskom has been decimated. Transnet has been destroyed. The post office is just disappearing. And they've got mountains of outstanding debt, those state-owned enterprises. But again, there's a good news story here. The good news story in the case of Eskom is the private sector is starting to generate electricity. They didn't want the private sector to generate electricity. It doesn't make sense with the ANC. It doesn't fit in with their ideology. But gradually what happened is that reality started overtaking the ideology. And the ideology has become less important because the reality simply has overtaken the various ideologies. And we can see that in Eskom. There are signs of better management at Eskom. But the outstanding debt of Eskom is still 350 billion rand. That's a lot of money. Transnet, there are also signs of improvement, but after they've destroyed it. And Transnet is the improvement is where the private sector is getting involved in the railroads, where the private sector is getting involved in the harbours. And Michelle Phillips, the new CEO of Transnet, is doing an excellent job in getting more private sector participation. And here's the irony, where the ANC wants to centralize everything. Because of the incompetence and everything that goes with that, they destroyed everything, and in the process, things are being decentralized. And the private sector is picking up all these pieces, and the private sector is doing actually quite a good job. Now, I just want to talk about a little bit about the budget. So, last year, a few very important things happened in South Africa. One is South Africa was taken off the so-called grey list. Now, that's good for me because I open bank accounts for people internationally, and if I have to fill in a lot of papers like this and the banks do not want to open bank accounts, my clients get very angry at me. They think it's me. But it's not the case. Banks do not want to do business if you're on the grey list. And you have to fill in a lot of forms. Now, we've been taken off the grey list, and that's a wonderful thing that happened to us, allowing South Africa to trade more internationally, but allowing for capital to flow easier as well. You can open a bank account. All right, that's one easy thing. But there's something else that happened as well. And that fits in with, that's important for what's currently happening in the Middle East. And that is the Minister of Finance in October last year reduced the inflation targets to a point target of 3%. Now, previously what we had the 3 to 6% inflation target range in South Africa. And the Reserve Bank, under the management of Lesetja Kganyago, he tried to manage inflation within that 3 to 6% band. And you do that, if inflation gets too high, you increase interest rates to take demand out of the system, and if it goes too low, you lower interest rates again. So he manages down gradually within 3 to 6%, and then later on he said, listen, I'm not going to target 3 to 6, because if you target 3 to 6, then 6 becomes the target. I'm going to target 4.5. With a bit of a deviation around 4.5. And he said, yes, that's what we're going to do. And for some time, he targeted 4.5, and they got pretty close to that, around 4.5 more or less, which was fine. And then last year, around about the beginning of the year, he said, no, I've decided, Lesetja Kganyago, I'm going to target 3%. And the Minister of Finance got very angry at him, because the prerogative of setting the inflation targets is that of the Minister of Finance. And he did not want to lower the inflation targets. There are reasons for that, but very importantly, it's his job, and he wants to get the credit of lowering the inflation target. And now this guy at the Reserve Bank decided to unilaterally lower the inflation targets in South Africa. The reason why politicians do not like low inflation is because they want to spend more money continuously. And that's exactly the reason why Lesetja Kganyago didn't want to lower the inflation targets, because he himself, in his expenditure estimates for the next 3 years, we've got a rolling budget, 3-year rolling budget, he keeps on increasing expenditure by more than 6% in many cases, in any event. So he didn't want to be limited to a lower inflation target. And also, some institutions like Eskom, for example, they can increase their prices by 9 and 12% when the inflation rate is low. And he knows that if Eskom doesn't increase their prices by this totally ridiculous percentages, then he needs to keep on funding Eskom, and he hasn't got the money to do that. So he wants high inflation. And also crucially important, the Minister of Finance wants high inflation because inflation reduces the value of money, but inflation reduced the value of debt as well. And the debt levels of the Minister of Finance is currently at record high levels. So that's why. But fortunately, there was a lot of pressure on the Minister of Finance, and eventually in October he said, okay, from now on, we will lower the inflation targets to 3%. Now that's a big deal for a number of reasons. One is that when inflation targets are lower, prices do go up, and prices do go up and down all the time, and it's crucially important for prices to go up and down. But when all prices go up because of inflation, you can't see the signals. And if you can't see the signals, you cannot allocate your scarce resources, and your economy cannot grow well. So in a high inflation environment, economic growth is always weak. Low inflation doesn't guarantee economic growth, but high inflation guarantees low economic growth. So the Minister of Finance lowered the inflation target to 3%, and that means that the lower inflation target is likely to support economic growth going forward as well. But there's another very important factor. Remember, if my inflation rate is higher than that of the Americans, for example, my currency loses its value quicker than that of the Americans. And that's over time. You see the rand getting weaker, or other way around, getting weaker and weaker against most of the so-called hard currencies. And the reason is because our inflation is higher than theirs. And that means if a foreigner wants to invest in your country, he must always reckon that the chances are that if I put my money in South Africa and I take it out in a year's time, the money is going to be worth less because the rand lost some of its value subsequently. So there's a risk involved for foreigners to invest in your country in a high inflation environment. But now that inflation is lower and inflation expectations are coming lower as well, you remove the risk, or at least you reduce the risk for foreigners investing in your country, and see what happened. The foreigners started investing in South Africa. They bought our equities. The equities did very well. They bought the bonds in South Africa. They bought the South African rand. And we saw all these wonderful things happening on the financial market in South Africa. And that resulted in the Reserve Bank cutting interest rates, and that will spill over into the real economy, and that's likely to support economic economic growth in South Africa as well. So that's what happened last year. And that's why economists were quite optimistic when the Minister of Finance delivered his budget speech about 2 weeks ago, because that's what happened last year. The real economy, the financial part of the economy is doing quite well. The real part of the economy, there's a bit of a problem because there are some policies that are still obstacles to economic growth. NHI stuff, for example, expropriation stuff and all that sort of stuff. We need to get rid of that before people will really start buying. They're buying our equities, they're buying our bonds, and they're buying our currency, but they're not investing in factories and in mines. That's what we want them to do. And they will only start doing that when you change some of these other policies. So those are the obstacles still preventing the South African economy to grow at 4%, 5%, and 6%, which can happen. Let me just go to the budget. Just look at a few things in the budget. So the Minister of Finance said, state revenue is going to do better than expected because of this nice commodity cycle. Platinum prices, gold prices going up, and he's getting more taxes out of that, close to about 50 billion extra. That means he can make some adjustment to personal income taxes, adjust the brackets. He didn't lower it, he simply adjusted the brackets for inflation. And a few other taxes. He increased a few sin taxes and so on, but he made some adjustments on value-added taxes and stuff like that. That's on the revenue side. The problem that the Minister of Finance has is that very few individuals pay just about all the taxes of the Minister of Finance. There are 65 million people in South Africa, and a small percentage of them pay just about all the personal income taxes, which is the most important revenue source for the Minister of Finance. The only tax that they can get more money out of is actually by increasing value-added tax, but politically that's very difficult to do. He also cannot increase personal income taxes because the moment he does that, people will stop paying or they will immigrate. And in fact, people are already immigrating. We are completely overtaxed on personal income taxes. Company taxes, he also did not adjust, and again, the tax base is very extremely narrow on company taxes as well. 1,000 companies pay 80% of all the company taxes in South Africa. So on the revenue side, the Minister of Finance got it very difficult because typically the people where he gets his money from, there are very few of them, and they are not necessarily ANC supporters. On the expenditure side, there are 27 million people receiving grants from the state, from the Minister of Finance, and he decided to increase the grants by 3.8%. So the grant recipients, they get 2,400 Rand for an old age grant and 560, 70 Rand for a child support grant and so on. He increased that by 3.8%. Those are very poor people, and their increase was 3.8%. But they also decided to increase the civil servants' salary with the wage bill by 4.4%. Civil servants in South Africa, there are 2 million of them. They are mostly overpaid and mostly underworked. And they're going to get 4.4% over the next 3 years. That's the plan of the Minister of Finance. But he hid it somewhere in the budget speech. You can't see it there. And that's what we got to stop. And we have to confront this, that there are 2 million people out of a population of 65 million people, and they are paid. The wage bill is equal to 18% of the economy. 18% of the economy we pay to the civil servants. 35% of total state expenditure goes to the salary wage bill of civil servants. That is the real state capture. The civil servants and the tenderpreneurs in South Africa. That's the real new state capture. Coming back to the budget of the Minister of Finance. So the debt levels, Minister of Finance currently is 79% of GDP. It's likely to start leveling up. To leveling down, it's very high. Each one of you owe more than 100,000 Rand more than what you think you owe. That's a debt that the Minister of Finance borrowed or incurred on your behalf. And you're going to pay it back over time eventually. So the debt levels, very high, at 79%, close to 80% of GDP. But economists generally agree that we're probably going to see that leveling off now. We're going to see a little bit stronger economic growth, not too much, a little bit stronger economic growth. And with a bit of luck, and with the local authority elections at the end of this year, things can start turning around. And that's where we were 10 days or 2 weeks ago when the war struck. So I'm afraid what's going to happen in South Africa now, we're not going to see those 225 basis points reduction in interest rates that I thought was possible this year, or maybe 3 times 25. I don't know if the Reserve Bank is going to increase interest rates. I think they certainly not going to reduce interest rates, not at this meeting, and most definitely not in the next meeting. If oil price remains where it is, if it goes up to $120, for example, then it becomes part of the system, it becomes part of the momentum of inflation, then we need an increase in interest rates. And as soon as the Reserve Bank does that, the sooner we can prevent this from picking up too much momentum. So an interest rate cycle, I'm afraid, it is not as rosy as it used to be only 10 days ago or so. As far as the fiscal accounts of the Minister of Finance are concerned, the economy is likely to grow at significantly lower than the 1.6% that he expected in the budget, probably 1.2, maybe 1.3%, something like that. The debt levels to GDP is likely to keep on going up. The possibility of an upgrade for South Africa's debt, that's not going to happen soon. So everything has been kicked down the road. Everything has been postponed in the best case scenario. In a bad scenario, the oil price goes to $150, $120 even, and stays there for 6 months, then we're talking about 50, 75, 100 basis points increase in interest rates. And we're talking about the Minister of Finance borrowing much more money. We're talking about a much weaker currency than what we have at the moment. That is a possible scenario. The reality is I do not know what is going to happen because it keeps on changing. I'm going to walk out now and I'm going to have a look at what's happening on the financial markets to get a better idea. But the world changed in a matter of 10 days. And it is not ever going to be the same. And it's going to, in the very best case scenario, all the good things that was likely beginning to happen in South Africa has been kicked down the road for at least 6 months or so. So my advice to people is there are some more things happening in South Africa that's actually quite good. The judiciary in South Africa very much independent. The same for the press in South Africa very much independent. But the best thing in South Africa is that we still have a democracy that works very well. And it is your responsibility to make sure that you use the pen or the pencil in your hand to make sure that we change the political landscape in South Africa, because as long as the ANC is one of the dominant political parties, this economy will not reach its potential of 5 and 6% economic growth. En die laaste opmerking is, julle moet nou geen wette breek nie, maar julle moet tog doen wat julle kan om so min as moontlik belasting te betaal. Dankie dat julle na my geluister het.